When my wife Sarah died of pancreatic cancer, everything changed in ways I couldn't even begin to imagine. I could no longer afford the house we bought together on my income alone, so I had to sell the property at a loss and relocate to an older, smaller home on the edge of town. The weeks blurred into months as grieving members of her family came by to collect belongings left behind in the will. Friends stopped by to offer a shoulder to cry on and help move me into the new home. Having a job that allowed me to work from home used to feel like an incredible perk. Without Sarah around and little to no reason or motivation to leave the new home I found myself living in, that perk began to feel more suffocating. At first, I dismissed the subtle shadows moving around in the peripheral of my vision as just a side effect of my grief-stricken mind. I'd oftentimes hear odd noises emanating from somewhere in the house, but I'd ignore it, thinking it was just a byproduct of how old the place must have been. One night I asked an old high school buddy of mine, Donnie, to help move in some old furniture with his truck. Even without offering to pay for the gas, he seemed happy to help and offer his condolences. After his decade-old pickup made the trip down that old dirt road for the last time, I invited him inside for a drink. We were at the table, catching up on old times, when he offered up a suggestion. "You know, Mike, this new place of yours is kinda creepy. I think it could use a remodeling." I let my gaze sweep around the kitchen before offering up any response. Faded floral wallpaper and warped wooden floorboards reinforced his point. "Yeah, I'll probably get around to it eventually. Hey, if you ever need me, man," Donnie said, placing a hand on my shoulder. "I'm here for you, buddy." A weak smile was the best I could muster. We talked about old friends and new hobbies, and for a moment I almost forgot Sarah was gone. But Donnie needed to go home eventually, and once again I found myself alone in a home I couldn't seem to feel familiar with. Well beyond midnight, I sulked in the living room and gazed out at a full moon that brought a subtle glow to the backyard. An overgrowth of tall grass and weeds choked the ground outside, reminding me of yet another chore I'd need to address. It was during this thought I caught a faint shimmer of my own reflection in the window, and the shadow of a person standing behind where I sat on the couch. I spun around, heart nearly exploding into my throat, only to see the empty kitchen illuminated by faint moonlight. Glancing back at the window, the shadowy image I saw was gone. Realizing I must have been way too tired and overwhelmed, I headed off to a nightmare-filled sleep that only lasted a few hours. After 6 full months had given Sarah's passing all it needed to fully sink in, I slipped into a daily routine. I'd wake up at the crack of dawn, get my work done just in time for lunch, and spend the rest of my day outside of the house. Not just because my friends recommended hobbies and doing literally anything to keep my mind off of the grief, but because there was just something about being alone in that house. I couldn't stay outside forever, of course, and eventually I'd have to come home and put in earplugs to drown out the creaks, scratches, and occasional soft whispers that would randomly resonate from within the walls. Donnie even laughed when I told him I'd gotten into the habit of sleeping with the lights on because I was tired of shadows moving around in places they shouldn't. Things took a sudden turn for the worse when we began remodeling. Donnie showed up one night with his truck full of paint, tools, and other stuff, and we got to work doing what he suggested just half a year prior. "What the hell?" Donnie exclaimed, nearly making me bump my head on the pipes underneath the sink as I crouched down to clean the rust. "What?" I asked, turning to see the color drain slightly from his face. "Something just moved in the hallway over there, Mike." He pointed down the dim passage that connected the kitchen and living room to the 2 bedrooms. I didn't see anything there, but after experiencing the creeps for months on end, I didn't have any reason not to believe him. "Was it a shadowy figure?" "Yeah, how'd you know?" I sighed and took off the rubber gloves that were soaked with rust-removing chemicals. "I've been seeing stuff like that since I moved in. Thought it was just my mind processing everything, but I guess not." "Mike, do you believe in paranormal stuff? Because whatever I saw seriously just gave me the creeps." I pondered the question for a moment. In another life, I would have told Donnie I was a hard skeptic, that facts and logic could explain away anything. Man, after the last 6 months, I don't know what's possible. After Donnie left that night, I decided to do some research about the house online. Couldn't find much, other than the fact it was foreclosed in the 70s because the owner couldn't make payments on the mortgage. There was one curious detail, however. Online it was listed as a 3-bedroom house, yet I only had 2. In the following weeks, activity ramped up as Donnie and I got more work done on the house. The day we replaced the old floorboards in the kitchen, a mug somehow fell out of a closed cabinet and shattered on the countertops. Random splotches of blood appeared on the bathroom walls and Donnie denied any involvement of it being there. The worst experience had to be the night we replaced the busted window in the guest bedroom, because we both heard loud and heavy footsteps coming from the kitchen. When we went to investigate, hundreds of dead flies were sprawled across the floor even though I've never had a fly problem. "Man, I can't do this anymore, Mike. This is freaking me out." That was all Donnie had to say about the flies that night before grabbing his things and stepping out for the last time. I decided that night to list the house for sale with a realtor online. Unfortunately, because this house was an old fixer-upper that sat far away from town on a lonely dirt road, I'd never see anyone interested in buying. Not even after lowering the price several times. One day, I looked into acquiring the old floor plan for the house to figure out the layout for some plumbing issues. That's when I noticed the diagram showed a third room that didn't seem to exist. This room, according to the floor plan, would sit between the guest bedroom and the kitchen, connected by a third door in the hallway where Donnie saw that shadowy figure one night. Sure enough, I took a tape measure and calculated the square footage for the guest bedroom and the length of the hallway and discovered there was more than enough space to accommodate another room. I called up Donnie to try and convince him to check it out with me, but he remained firm on never stepping foot into my haunted house ever again. Resigning to the fact I'd have to rent some of my own tools for the job, I began tearing down the wall that would hide this supposed third bedroom. Picking the centralmost spot on the hallway, I slammed a sledgehammer into the drywall and found success with a fist-sized hole. Crouching down, I peeked into the hole, only to find pitch black on the other side. After smacking the wall a few more times to make the hole bigger, I retrieved a flashlight and directed it into the darkness. Ice rushed into my veins when I saw what lay beyond in a mostly empty room. Hanging on the wall and reflecting the beam of my flashlight was an ornate mirror with gold trim, appearing like a relic from the past. It wasn't the mirror that caused my blood to freeze over, however. It was the human skull that sat directly underneath it on the floor. It took the police all night to investigate that room and search the property for any additional remains, but that skull was all they could find. They tore a doorway-sized hole in the wall during their investigation, leaving that mirror on full display whenever walking down the hallway. I put the mirror up for sale online, but I didn't have any more luck selling that old antique than I did the creepy house it was found in. Every night since opening that hidden room, I'd swear there would be a figure in the mirror every time I walked down the hallway to get to my bedroom. One night when I got up to use the bathroom, I caught a glimpse of an emaciated, bony arm protruding out of the hole in the wall leading to that room, only to be gone when I did a double take. That's when I had enough of that damn mirror. I took it down and put it in the closet where I wouldn't need to look at it anymore. When I awoke the next morning and saw that mirror hanging back on the wall, I knew I had to get the hell out of that house. This wasn't grief or faulty memory or even a carbon monoxide problem. Something was deeply wrong with the house I had purchased and I couldn't stand being there anymore. I was an hour into packing my bags for a long extended trip to go somewhere, anywhere else when I heard a soft cry coming from the hallway. If it didn't sound like her, I would have given that hallway and by extension that mirror the bird. Sarah. The crying stopped, but I knew it was her voice. There couldn't be any mistaking it, that was her voice. My heart beat a million times in the few moments it took to slowly walk over to the opening in the hallway. Standing there at the precipice of a room that had not existed until just a few days ago, I found my gaze drawn to the mirror. That's when her face began to materialize. Her red hair, freckled face, and arresting green eyes. A deep longing tugged at my heart and sank it into sorrowful depths as I blinked and the apparition of my wife vanished from the mirror. I stood in a deeply uncomfortable silence for what must have been 10 full minutes before the smoke alarm snapped me back to reality. Rushing out of the hallway, my jaw dropped at a wall of fire that erupted out of the decades-old stove and began consuming the walls and cabinets around it. The gravity of the situation didn't dawn on me until I had grabbed what little belongings I could and escaped from the smoke that rapidly began filling the home. According to the firefighters, the blaze was caused by some fault in the gas lines that combusted when an old wire somehow came into contact with the gas line. Yet, when I looked at the roaring flame that consumed that old house and I swore I saw a twisted face materialize in the heat and ash, I wasn't so sure. It's been a few years since that all happened, and I live in a new house in the city now. A cozy one-bedroom, one-bathroom flat that accommodates everything I'd ever need. Part of me is still grieving, of course. What brings me to tell this story is the fact I got a package in the mail yesterday, marked with no return address. When I opened the package and saw the color draining from my face in a mirror that should have been melted years ago, I knew right then and there I shouldn't have tampered with that old house.
It wasn't like me to answer a job listing that looked suspicious. I just spent too many hours scrolling through another endless feed of listings when I came across it. Night attendant needed. Historic Arcadian hotel. Must be reliable, detail-oriented, and trustworthy. Pays $500 per shift. $500 a night. That was more than I'd made in a week at any of my recent gigs, and I was broke enough to take the risk. Plus, it was the Arcadian, an old hotel I'd walked by countless times but never seen anyone actually go into. I'd always wondered what was hidden behind its ivy-covered walls and cracked marble facade, a relic of another time right in the heart of the city. So I applied. The email response arrived less than a day after I applied. They attached a quick questionnaire, then sent a brief email confirming that I'd been hired and was expected to report that night. The day before my shift, an envelope arrived at my apartment. Inside, a small brass key, along with a second envelope containing a check for $500 and a handwritten note. Congratulations, and welcome to the Arcadian family. Enclosed is your master key. You'll need this key to let yourself in and access certain parts of the hotel. Enter through the main doors by 10 p.m. Your first shift begins promptly at 11 p.m. Training will be available in the back room behind the front desk. Please watch all training materials before starting your shift. We appreciate your commitment to rebuilding the legacy of the Arcadian. Curious, and admittedly a little nervous, I made my way to the hotel that night. The Arcadian was just as I'd imagined. The exterior was a fading memory of elegance. Worn stone walls with crumbling edges, tall windows with elegant exterior spotlights that no longer worked. I glanced at the clock on my phone. 9:45. I had time. The hotel's lobby was huge, dominated by a grand staircase. Dust layered every surface, and the faintest whiff of mildew hung in the air. I took a breath, suppressing a shiver, and walked toward the front desk. Behind it was a small door labeled staff only. This must be where they wanted me to watch the training. Inside the staff room, I found a TV set atop a rolling cart and a row of numbered VHS tapes stacked next to it. The first tape had a label on it in looping script, Arcadian Employee Training, 1952. Next to it was a sheet of paper with instructions. Watch all tapes in order. Do not skip ahead. I slid the first tape into the VHS player and turned on the TV. The screen flickered, a hum crackling through the speakers, and then it jumped to life. A video came up which looked in rough shape, like it was a copy of a copy. A cheerful man in a sharp 1950s suit stood in front of a pristine version of the lobby I just walked through. "Welcome to the Arcadian family," he began with a polished grin. "We are delighted to have you on board as a steward of one of New York's finest luxury establishments." His tone was light, upbeat, but he had a strange way of pausing, just momentarily, between each sentence to smile. "Let's begin with a few simple rules to keep our guests safe and happy," he continued. "Remember, our guests may at times be unique, but they deserve the utmost courtesy and the finest of service. Now, please follow these essential guidelines. The first few videos went over the basics, instructions on how to clean, address guests, check-ins and check-outs, when to check the guest log, and where to find supplies. But on the final video, things took a toke for the strange. Congratulations on making it to the end of your training. Attaboy! Now, let's cover a few final essentials to keep our guests smiling and keep you right as rain. Listen close now. These pointers are real important. Rule number 1. If the elevator takes you to the basement, do not be alarmed. Simply close your eyes and stand still until it moves back up. No peeking. The man chuckled in a practiced, rehearsed way, as though he'd been told to laugh but wasn't sure why. My stomach twisted at his words. The basement? Why would the elevator just take me to the basement? Rule number 2. If you find a guest wandering the halls between 2 and 4 a.m., gently escort them back to their room. Under no circumstances should you allow them near the front doors. Use a firm hand if needed. If they seem upset, simply assure them that it will all be over soon. A chill ran through me. What kind of guest would be staying here, anyway? The hotel wasn't even open. I tried to shake off the unease. The man's smile remained fixed as he went on with the rules. Rule number 3. Do not look into the mirrors after midnight. Our mirrors sure is something else. We wouldn't want you to become disoriented. Rule number 4. Every night, count all the keys on the board. Make sure all your keys are accounted for. Most importantly, there should always be 4 keys marked for the 10th floor. If one of those keys are missing, lock up the lobby doors, turn off the lights, and wait behind the front desk until dawn. Do not attempt to look for it. 10th floor? I thought. The hotel doesn't even have 10 floors. He proceeded with a few more rules. Rule number 5. Now listen closely, folks. If a gentleman with a yellow umbrella comes in asking, "Do you have a vacancy?" you must politely reply, "I'm sorry, we have no vacancy." No matter how upset he gets, stay calm and cheerful. That's the way to keep things running smoothly. Rule number 6. Attention, night owl. If you find that key 309 is missing at the start of your shift, here's what you do. Whip up a ham and cheese sandwich. Gather those supplies from the kitchen. Then, head on over to room 309 and give a polite knock. Remember, don't make eye contact. Just hold out that plate and wait until you hear the door close before you step away. You've got it. Rule number 7. Now, let's talk about Ronald, our cleaning ace. He'll waltz in and say, "I'm here to clean the mess," to which you'll unlock the custodian closet and let Ronald take it away. If he doesn't give you that magic phrase, simply say, "No cleaning needed tonight, Ronald," and don't forget to lock the doors tight after he leaves. That's how we keep everything shipshape. Last but not least, rule number 8. Now listen up, friends. It's important you remember this. Never, and I mean never, enter the management office. If you happen to find the door slightly ajar, just keep on walking and mind your business. And if you hear any peculiar sounds coming from inside, don't let your curiosity get the better of you. Simply carry on with your tasks. We want to keep everything peachy keen around here. What the F? I thought. The next few minutes focused on specifics of the hotel layout, explaining what doors led where, how to reset the breaker, and the importance of logging any guest encounters in the shift report binder. The rules he'd given, though, stuck with me like a bad taste. That concludes our training. You're now ready to head on out there and knock it out of the park. Thank you again for your commitment to the Arcadian legacy. Finally, I switched off the TV. By then, it was a little after 11 p.m., so I made my way to the front desk to get a feel for my new workspace. The first part of the night was uneventful. The Arcadian was silent except for a soft hum. I completed the tasks in the handbook they'd given me, accounting for all the keys, sweeping the lobby, wiping down the desk. It was eerie, but manageable. I settled in behind the front desk, scrolling through my phone and waiting for the night to pass by. At around 1:30 a.m., the front door of the hotel opened. An old man shuffled into the lobby. He wore a faded custodian uniform that looked like it had seen better days, and I could barely make out the name tag reading Ronald as he drew closer. He moved slowly, his feet dragging slightly on the worn carpet, and I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I knew I had to wait for him to say the phrase that would confirm he was here for his nightly duties. When he finally reached the desk, he looked up at me with weary eyes and said, "I'm here to clean the mess." A wave of relief washed over me as I realized he'd said it. I quickly unlocked the custodian closet, my hands trembling slightly as I fumbled with the keys. As he pulled out his cart, filled with an assortment of cleaning supplies and tools, he glanced at me, almost amusingly, and asked, "New here?" "Yeah, it's my first night. Any tips?" I replied, eager to learn anything that might ease my nerves. "Stick to the rules, and you'll be just fine, kid," he said before turning back to his cart. He wheeled it toward the elevator, the cart rattling softly behind him. As he stepped inside, the doors closed with a quiet thud, leaving me alone again. Ronald's words did little to ease my nerves. I was still trying to figure out what those rules might really mean and why seemingly mundane rules would be so important to follow. When I returned to my desk, I noticed almost immediately a space on the key rack. A key was now missing. The key to room 309. Panic rose in my chest as I rifled through the key rack again, hoping it was just hiding among the others. Where the hell did it go? I muttered to myself, feeling a bead of sweat form on my forehead. I had barely left the desk for more than a minute. Had someone come in while I was with Ronald? Or had I just missed it during my last count? I quickly pulled out my notes, scanning for the rule about the ham sandwich. There it was. If key 309 is missing, bring a ham and cheese sandwich to the room and knock, avoiding eye contact. I sighed, resigning myself to follow the rule. Heading into the kitchen, I was surprised to find it fully stocked, despite the hotel's long period of inactivity. The shelves were lined with canned goods and an impressive assortment of fresh ingredients, as if someone had prepared for a busy night. I quickly gathered the supplies and assembled a ham sandwich, placing it carefully on a plate. With the plate in hand, I took a deep breath and headed for the elevator. The fluorescent lights flickered as I pressed the button for the third floor, and I felt a twinge of unease as I rode up. When the doors opened, I walked down the hallway, the carpet muffling my footsteps. I approached room 309 and knocked gently on the door, my heart racing. I heard shuffling inside, and after a moment, the door creaked open. I instinctively lowered my head, avoiding any eye contact. A figure stood in the doorway, reaching out to take the plate from my hands. They lingered there for an extra moment, as if waiting to see if I would look up. I kept my head down, my heart pounding in my chest. After a tense pause, the figure shut the door quietly, leaving me standing in the dim hallway, a chill running down my spine. I let out my breath, realizing now that I had been holding it. I turned and walked away, the feeling of being watched weighing heavily on me. What is with this fucking hotel, I thought. I got in the elevator, feeling relieved to head back to the safety of my desk. What were with all these rules anyway? What kind of hotel is this? Questions raced through my brain as I took the ride back down to the lobby. The elevator descended, and as it approached the lobby, I got closer to the doors, anticipating my exit. Only it didn't stop at the lobby. It kept going down. Panic washed over me as I realized what was happening. The basement. No, 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 I said as the elevator descended. I desperately smashed my hand against the buttons, hitting any floor that would possibly bring me back up. But the elevator didn't stop. Forcing myself to calm down, I remembered the rules and I shut my eyes tightly, clenching my fists at my sides. The elevator dinged, and the doors opened, unleashing a rush of cold air that sent a shiver down my spine. The damp, musty smell filled my nostrils. I stood there, back against the wall, heart pounding, waiting anxiously to see what would happen next. Then I heard something moving, slow and deliberate, getting closer. The smell hit me like a punch to the gut, a putrid stench that filled the air and clawed at my throat. It was a sickening blend of rot and decay that seemed to wrap around me, making it hard to breathe. The elevator creaked, and I felt it move slightly, as if something heavy, very heavy, had entered it. I could feel it, whatever it was, right there, right against me, hovering right in front of my face. My pulse was racing, and tears began to stream down my face. I could feel it staring at me, like a predator, waiting, praying for me to open my eyes. What was probably only seconds felt like an eternity of pure horror. Just then, the doors dinged again, and I felt myself moving back upward. I slowly opened my eyes to find the doors now open, looking back out to the lobby and the grand staircase. I ran out of the elevator, ready to rush out of the front doors and quit on the spot. But that's when I noticed it. Dawn was breaking outside, and a new envelope was sat on top of the desk. Hesitantly, I opened the envelope, sniffling like a child and wiping the tears from my face. Inside the envelope was another $500 check and a note. Great job on your first shift. As a thank you, we have included your pay up front for tomorrow night. If you choose to not return, feel free to keep the check as a courtesy from us. But we hope you do return. You are a valuable addition to the Arcadian Hotel family. Management. I took the check and left the hotel, fully convinced I would never return. That was last night. Back home, I've paced my small apartment all day, the check burning a hole in my pocket, and the sunlight giving me a sense of security. I wanted to quit. The nightmares and anxiety of last night are too much. But then I thought about my bills, my empty fridge, the weight of my loans. I've been staring at this check, the memory of Ronald's words echoing in my mind. Stick to the rules and you'll be just fine, kid. Maybe I can figure it out. Maybe I can endure just a little longer. I've resolved to return to the hotel. I will follow the rules, keep my head down, and stay focused on the prize. Tonight, I will walk into that hotel again, ready to face whatever horrors await me. The money is too enticing to walk away from, and maybe I can even find out whatever is going on with the Arcadian Hotel. After all, it's just a job, right? I had been walking my dog down my street, minding my own business, when something caught my eye on the other side of my next-door neighbor, Mr. Carlson's lawn. After standing there for a moment, unable to put my finger on it, I eventually noticed a key just hanging there in the doorknob of his front door. Not thinking too much of it, I went on with my walk and immediately forgot about it. But then the next day, I saw it again, as did I the next day after that, and the next day after that. Eventually, after a week had passed, I started to get worried. See, the thing is, I would have maybe written off the key as a simple mistake before going on a trip, but Mr. Carlson was quite old and frail and had stopped leaving his house a long time ago, depending on caretakers for groceries and basic home goods. Which brought me to my next conclusion, that it must have been one of his caretakers. But then I remembered that they stopped by his house every few days and surely would have noticed the key. Finally, after 2 weeks of indecision, I worked up the courage to walk over to Mr. Carlson's door, place my hand on the doorknob, the key still hanging from it, and turn the knob. As I turned it, I couldn't help but hear a faint echo, like the sound of a couple people shouting from 100 yards away. I stopped and looked around. Nothing. I turned back to the door and opened it. Fearing the worst, I braced myself, closing my eyes. Upon opening them, I simply saw an empty foyer and let out a sigh of relief. But what I didn't know was that the worst thing that I feared was nowhere near what I'd soon discover. Mr. Carlson, I called out before shutting the door behind me. Click! Suddenly, the lights went out, and I saw Mr. Carlson and Brenda, our neighborhood post office worker, sitting on the staircase together, a look of horror in their eyes. Mr. Carlson, what a relief. And Brenda? I haven't seen her in a week. I thought to myself, remembering the past week's strange lack of mail that everyone in the neighborhood had been talking about. Looking back on it, I should have put 2 and 2 together. But what possibly could the disappearance of our mail person and a key in my neighbor's door have in common? I was about to find out. Brenda, what are you doing in Mr. Carlson's house? She simply replied, the key. Oh, it's yours? I asked, letting out a sigh of relief. After spending 2 weeks running through every possible reason for it being left in the door. But before I could bask in the moment, she interrupted me. No, it's not mine. Or his, she said before turning to Mr. Carlson, who looked exhausted. It belongs to him. The old man said. Him? I asked, confused by where he was going with it. The man who visits us. Brenda said. Visits you? What do you mean? Just wait. We'll be back, especially now that you're here. Mr. Carlson said. He's right. I entered just like you did, after dropping off the mail and wondering if something was the matter. Finding Mr. Carlson here, and that I was trapped inside. And within a few minutes, the man arrived. Brenda explained. Wait, what are you trying to tell me? that you're trapped here. The old man said. Trapped? I laughed. Yeah, okay. Is this some sort of Halloween prank? What with the lights off and everything? That's when I casually walked back over to the door and tried to open it. Click, but it didn't budge. I stood there for a moment, with my back to Brenda and Mr. Carlson, wondering if maybe there was some truth to what they were saying. And that's when I heard him. See, a hoarse, disturbing voice called out from behind me. They're right. You're trapped. Chills ran down my spine as I realized that the voice couldn't be coming from Brenda or Mr. Carlson. I couldn't bear to turn around, so I simply called back to the voice. Who are you? I'm the keeper of the keys to your worst nightmares. I turned around to find a man standing there in the darkness, his eyes glowing and keychains dangling from every inch of his body. Let us out, I screamed at him, pretending to be courageous, but terrified by the mere sight of such a thing. He simply replied, certainly, before looking at his body and removing a particular keychain with one key on it. Yes, this one's for you, he said as he handed it to me. This will open the front door from the inside. Go ahead, leave. I looked at the key, then back at the door, then back at the monster and smiled. You idiot. Why would you ever give it to me? I'll be back with the police, and you better not be here. Then I walked over to the front door and inserted the key. Don't do it, Brenda cried out. He's tricking you, Mr. Carlson added. But I was too compelled by my plan to listen to them and proceeded to turn the doorknob. Click. It opened. See, I said, as I turned back to Brenda and Mr. Carlson with a smug look on my face. They simply shook their heads in disappointment. I turned back, opened the door, stepped outside, and shut it behind me to find myself in a bedroom. My childhood bedroom, to be exact. What the? I thought to myself, as once again, chills ran down my spine, feeling unsettled by being in there. I opened the door and entered the second-story hallway, where I heard the sound of someone being strangled in a nearby bedroom. Normally, I would have been shocked to hear such a sound, but this was one that I had heard before. This was a memory that I was reliving in real life now as an adult. A tear rolled down my cheek as I knew exactly what was happening in the other room, and despite my attempts to hold back, I couldn't stop myself from rushing into the bedroom and trying to stop him. But just as it had unfolded in real life, many years ago, by the time I opened the door, it was too late. My father was dead, strangled to death by my brothers for reasons I'd only later find out. Andrew, no, I cried out, but he had already crawled back into the corner of the room, simply staring at my father's lifeless body. That's when he looked up at me and charged at me like a ravenous zombie, managing to claw away at one of my arms before. Slam! I shut the door and ran downstairs, expecting to find my mother down there, just as I had found her when the event had originally happened. But all that I found was Brenda and Mr. Carlson, staring up at me with wide eyes. I'm sorry, Brenda said, seeing the expression on my face. How did you know? Because it happened to us, over and over, no matter which key he handed us. No, it can't be, I cried out as I began to shut down, unable to believe what they had told me. But I should have. As I stood there, shaking in horror, I heard the sound of keys rattling, and I turned around to find the monster standing there again. What do you want? I cried out, but he didn't answer. He simply looked down at his body and removed a particular keychain with one key on it. Yes, this one's for you, he said as he handed it to me. I looked at the key, then back at the door, then back at the monster, this time unable to smile. I knew another horror lay before me. Knew that the key would not help me escape the house. But for reasons I can't quite explain, maybe I thought there was an inkling of a chance that the key would work, or maybe it was a desire to see my father again. I took it anyway, took it and opened the door, only to relive the same horrifying memory and return back to the staircase where Brenda and Mr. Carlson were standing. Once again, the monster returned. Once again, he handed me a key, and once again, I disappeared through the door. This went on until I couldn't bear to take it anymore, and eventually gave up on the keys being of any help. When I finally declined the man's key, he simply replied, "Have it your way," before disappearing into the darkness. I turned to Brenda and Mr. Carlson, who went on to explain how they, too, had tried the keys and experienced nightmare after nightmare from their respective past. Then we all retired to the living room where we slept on the couch, chair, and floor, respectively, reasoning that we should stay in the same room. The next day, we huddled together, eventually coming to the conclusion that the house, its door, and the keys must be some sort of twisted test, caused by the key in the home's front door and enforced by the monster that wore an armor of keyrings. We tried everything, from scouring the home for exits, to attempting to make calls on its dead phones, to prying at its boarded windows from the inside out. But after a week had gone by without a single lead, we eventually gave up. That's when someone else arrived. No! We all screamed, our voices surely echoing outside, just as I heard them, as Officer Howe turned the key to the front door and let himself in. By the time the door had closed behind him, it was too late, and 3 had become 4. Once again, the monster returned, this time offering Officer Howe a key, who took it and let himself out, experiencing a nightmare of his own, only to return from upstairs a short time later with a look of horror in his eyes. After we told him our stories, he too declined the monster's next key, and we once again huddled together, eventually deciding that the answer must not lie in the house itself, but with the monster. But how do I stop it? I wondered. The next time he arrived, we tried to forcibly attack him as a group, but he simply waved his hand and froze us all in place until he disappeared back into the darkness. That's when I got an idea and took off after him into the darkness, following him for what felt like hours through a dark void until he reached a bedroom of his own. "What is this place?" I asked. "My own nightmare," he replied as he turned to a younger version of himself, asleep in bed. Suddenly, I saw a window slowly pry open as a masked man broke in and moved towards the young man with a knife. Not knowing what else to do, I sprang to the young man's rescue, darting toward the intruder and grappling with him, waking the young man, who watched on in horror as the masked man was somehow impaled on his own knife and toppled out the window. After catching my breath, I turned back to the young man, who had a smile on his face. "Thank you," he said as he handed me a key. I stood there in silence, unable to believe what had happened, before turning back to the monster, who I assumed had been watching the whole time. But he was gone. I turned back to the young man, who was still staring at me, then stumbled backwards out of his room and back into the darkness, where I turned around and walked back in the direction I had come from. When I finally emerged from the darkness, holding the key, I found Brenda, Mr. Carlson, and Officer Howe all standing there in the foyer, a look of shock on all their faces, having clearly expected that I would never return. I didn't say anything. I simply walked over to the home's front door, inserted the key, and opened it. Suddenly, a ray of sunshine burst into the home. I took a step outside and stood there for a moment until my eyes eventually adjusted to the daylight, and I found myself outside Mr. Carlson's home. The door still open, I looked back inside the home and saw Brenda, Mr. Carlson, and Officer Howe standing there in disbelief. I signaled for them to join me. Brenda and Officer Howe followed, with big smiles on their faces, overjoyed to escape the horrors in the home. But Mr. Carlson, he simply stayed behind. "Mr. Carlson, what are you waiting for?" But he didn't reply. He simply took a seat on the staircase. "Do me a favor. When you shut the door, leave the key inside the doorknob," the old man said. "But why?" I asked, unable to understand why he would choose to stay inside the place. "So I can see my son again," he explained. I then closed the front door of the house and looked down at its now keyless doorknob before reaching into my pocket for the key that the young man had given me. Officer Howe ran over to stop me, but it was too late. I had already placed the key in the doorknob and locked the door. He gave me a look of horror as I turned to see my wife pulling into my driveway next door. I looked over at her, and after spending what felt like weeks inside Mr. Carlson's home, expected her to be shocked to see me. But my wife simply waved hello, as if I had never left. "Don't forget to walk the dog," she called out casually before turning off the car and walking away into our home next door as Brenda and Officer Howe looked over at me, still shocked by what they had just experienced.
I found them this morning, stuffed between the torn seats of my old leather duffel bag. A brittle stack of my own journal entries from 30 years ago. Strange, considering I barely remember writing them, let alone journaling at all. I hardly remember anything from my early years, busy from driving coast to coast nonstop to build a decent bank account. Look how that turned out. It's my handwriting, no doubt. There it is, clear as day, looping and fierce across every line. The entries start like any trucker's log, full of routes and road conditions, little observations as we're taught to do at truck driving school. But as I read, the tone shifts, and my handwriting gets shaky and approximate. Then I remember. The night of Halloween, 1994. October 24th, 1994, there's something strange about Nevada this time of year. It's the way the desert wind has a bite to it, how it carries the smell of sagebrush and dust, how the sky turns from deep orange to bruised purple and makes the whole landscape look haunted. I'm due to drive across the state in the next few weeks. Got to Tonopah early, barely had time to grab a coffee. We're all meeting up at this truck stop off the 6, and it's a grimy place, but it has this campfire pit where we gather when the sun sets. Jerry said it was great at this of the year. Like a rite of passage, he said. They're all in their 40s, 50s, old-timers with the road written into their faces. I'm the youngest by a few decades, probably why most of the ones I don't know look at me like I shouldn't be there. Every time I go to one of these gatherings, usually the others ignore me, which is fine by me. October 27th, 1994, one guy I didn't recognize. Never seen him around before. Not new in and of itself, however, that one guy, just standing there at the edge of the firelight, silent as stone. Didn't say much, barely even looked up. None of the other guys seemed to be put off, but all ignored him unless spoken to. As always, I was more of a distraction. I probably shouldn't go to these anymore. Jerry hasn't even shown up. Just awkward. October 30th, 1994, they've gone from accidents to hauntings to outright superstitions. All of them drunk. We're huddled around the fire, about 20 of us. Multiple conversations, swapping stories. One of the guys, Tom I believe, even asked me where I'm headed next. That's when I heard it. Low and quiet, almost like a whisper. There's always the shortcut. The stranger stands a bit apart from us, arms crossed, eyes like coal. What? I said, turning around. You said you had to be in Denver by tomorrow. That's quite the ride. So I said, there's always the shortcut. Puzzled, I looked around at Tom, the guys. Not one met my eyes. I turned back towards the stranger, but he was gone. All that was and is left is his voice, deep and succinct. There's always the shortcut. No one has looked at me since then. Like the stranger's words had made me invisible. Better get to bed. Couldn't sleep. That man, he was waiting for me by my rig. I almost turned back, but he looked so desperate, his eyes wild and dark, and I felt something twist in my gut. Listen to me, he said, voice low, barely more than a breath. Whatever you do, don't take the shortcut. If you see it, just don't take it. He swallowed, glanced over his shoulder, and I swear, he looked as if he was running from something. Please, just don't. I tried to ask him what he meant, but he was already moving away, slipping into the shadows. I stood there, cold and confused, a bad taste in my mouth. Then I got back in the truck, shut the door, and locked it tight. I lay there, mind spinning, but sleep pulled me under. For a few hours at least. Better get back to it, the road is long to Denver. October 31st, 1994, I woke up late. Later than I'd planned. Anyway, there was no time for coffee, no time to think. I just threw my gear together and hit the road. The world around me hazy, like a half-remembered dream. The sky was still heavy with the last of the dawn haze as I pulled onto the empty road. It stretched out ahead of me, cutting through the flat Nevada desert like a scar. I couldn't shake the stranger's words from my mind, circling over and over. If you see it, something about that warning itched under my skin. The others, they just went silent like kids who'd been told a ghost story they half believed. This is a well-known route, pretty common, and not once had anyone mentioned a shortcut. So why that weird moment? Miles stretched on. The landscape was desolate, just sagebrush and scrub rolling on either side of the road, with the occasional rocky outcrop breaking up the monotony. By then, I'd made up for my late start. By noon, I'd hit that perfect rhythm where the hum of the engine melted into the background, and time began to slip. This was what I loved about the road, the way it let you disconnect. Even the strangest warnings and wildest stories could fade out here, where it was just you, the truck, and the endless blacktop. Then, sometime around late afternoon, something caught my eye. Up ahead, a thin track branched off from the main road, barely visible, like it was half buried under sand and years of disuse. My heart skipped. I knew the roads out here like the back of my hand, and I'd never noticed this turnoff before. The shortcut. My hands tightened on the wheel, and I slowed down, the gravel crunching under the tires as I approached the odd branch in the road. I could feel a strange pull, like something deep in my chest was telling me to turn, to see where that road went. But then, the stranger's words echoed again, and past I went. The shortcut quickly vanished in the rearview mirror and sent my mind racing. Was that it? Skipped the shortcut, if it even exists. I don't know how long I sat there, engine idling, in a trance. Didn't even remember stopping the truck. Hours have gone by. I'd better shift back into drive and merge onto the main road. Can't believe I lost all this time. The rest of the drive was quiet, almost too quiet. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky with fire and shadows, I felt that unease creep back in. The road seemed to stretch on forever. No other cars, no signs of life. Just me, my rig, and the empty desert. I finally stopped for the night about an hour ago, at a rest area miles near the Colorado border. As I killed the engine, I noticed something strange in the back of my mind. A foggy sort of sensation, like I'd left something behind on that road in Nevada, something I couldn't quite remember. November 1st, 1994, the first thing I remember is waking up with a start, like I'd been shaken out of a nightmare. But when I tried to recall any details, they slipped away, just shadows in the dark. I checked my log, saw the miles I'd covered, and my own scrawled handwriting in the entry from the night before. Skipped the shortcut, if it even exists. I don't remember writing that. October 30th, 2024, 30 years. And tomorrow, I'll be back on that same stretch of road, going east from Tonopah to Denver. I wonder if they still hold those gatherings with the campfire. The roads are different too, more highways, more mapped out, so probably not. And yet, I'm holding these old, brittle pages, reading my own handwriting like it belongs to a stranger. It's strange how certain memories stay sharp while others slip through your fingers. I still don't remember everything from that night, that trip. I don't remember much at all, but that thin strip of road branching off over and over, like it's always there, like a déjà vu. These pages, they're proof. Proof that something happened, something I can't, for the life of me, remember. Why did I stop? None of the later journals refer or even allude to that night in 1994. I must admit, the thought stroked me a few times since I got assigned that same route on that night 30 years later. Sharp as a knife, what if the shortcut is still there? The world's changed in 30 years. We're connected now, everything documented, recorded, tracked. Tomorrow I'll have cameras, a dash cam, and GPS. If the shortcut shows up again, if it even exists, I'll see it and I'll have proof. I'm not sure what I expect to find. Maybe just an overgrown trail leading to nowhere, or a memory that I can finally lay to rest. But there's a part of me that feels it, that deep, quiet pull, the same feeling I had all those years ago, sitting behind the wheel, staring down that thin, sandy track. I'll take the route east tomorrow, and if the shortcut's there, I'll record every mile, every minute. The sun's setting outside now, casting long shadows across my wall, and I feel that strange, familiar itch under my skin. The same one that whispered to me 30 years ago. This time, I'll take the shortcut. To start, to contextualize why and how I got in this whole mess. I take trips cross-country now and then. Started with my family, and after I moved out, I kept with it, typically 2 to 5 day ventures, and on those trips, I rest at a motel. Also, and should mention, I'm quite the night owl, sometimes not sleeping till 6 a.m., so I developed a hobby of taking nightly walks around the motels, even miles from them. It was always peaceful time for me. Obviously, I understand the typical concern, but I'm usually not worried. Currently standing at 6.2 feet, and don't carry any valuables worth stealing. Only my phone I got costing $25 at Walmart. I don't walk in alleyways, only stick to main roads, and this night wasn't an exception. The night in question. It was roughly the quarter waypoint from a party at Vegas that my friends held. And of course I was driving back alone, I didn't mind. I stopped at a pretty desolate motel. It wasn't exactly in the middle of nowhere, but the nearest gas station was 2 miles, but surprisingly in some decent business, I had to check in at a line with about 6 people. I got my key. I remember opening the room up, seeing the muted gray carpet, the yellowish white walls, and in comedic contrast, a 20-inch flat screen, and the distracting smell of cigarettes. I didn't care to complain. I was only here for the night. After 10 p.m., I took my walk. I was amazed looking at the parking lot, saw my car and one other. I thought people were checking in, guess not. Unreasonably dark and quiet is how I would describe that night. The long stretch of highway in the desert, only visible by the 2 rows of street lamps parallel to it. It seems to be a new moon, so the only way to separate the pitch-black sky from the ground was stars. For the time I was out there, I didn't see any car, but after a while, I did see something. For some reason, I was compelled to look behind me. There was, probably 200 feet away, a silhouette of a person, contrast from the orangey-brown ground. At the time, this wasn't scary exactly. Before, seeing people behind me usually meant they were passing by. The major difference is that would typically happen in streets closer to suburban areas. I was a little nervous, and that nervous escalated a bit when I decided to look behind again and saw that they were closer. I walked quite a lot that night. I looked back perpetually. Every time, little by little, they were coming closer. I had an idea: stop and let them pass. If they got close, eye them up and probably scare them off. I walk off a couple feet from road, face perpendicular to it, then stand in the dark. Looking over, and I see them in the same spot. I waited and they just didn't move. I tried to look at the time, but my phone wouldn't turn on. Now I didn't charge it before I walked, but it shouldn't be dead. It was 58%. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't wait here all night, but I had made a plan B. Down the road was a gas station. I should get there and maybe call a taxi or the cops. I had decided to walk fast. After a bit, I looked back again. They were much closer than expected. I got spooked and decided to run, but after a while, instead of farther, they even closer. Every time I moved faster, it moved faster, and instead of 80 feet away, now it was more like 30 feet. I stand still, look back, and could see them better, but just barely. I could tell they had pale skin, but the clothes were hard to make out, along with the body. He, I presume, was almost warped looking. The proportion of his arms and legs, and his posture looked crooked, and the seams of his clothes, you could see them, but they were in the wrong places. He had what I think was a hat, blob-shaped, and a rim so small you could barely notice. It was unpleasant to even process what I was looking at. I walked slowly to the gas station this time. It was tedious and aggravating. It didn't feel like 2 miles, it felt like 5. I should be able to see the gas station at this point, but I couldn't. I thought about how I should turn around and yell at him, demand him to leave, but every time I try bring up the thought, my brain refuses the option. I try to listen to his footsteps, but I only hear mine. No other noise, not animals, not wind, nothing, besides the hum of the street lamps. In fact, I didn't even see him move his legs to walk. Finally, I had a plan C, a plan that, for the most part, would work. I would move to the left side of the street and go back to the motel. In an instant, I brake for it, run across the road. On the left side, I looked back to where he was, and he was gone. A part of me already knew the truth, but I didn't have the heart confirm it. I walked back for what felt like countless hours, and I see it, the motel. I did it finally. I look back behind me. He was there. I was in a state of depression. I was at the gate. I needed to cross it, slowly and weakly, moving to the motel lobby. I remember the relief, closing the door, looking through the glass and not seeing him. And also seeing another human after so long. An elderly woman was working at the desk. Told her the story of a guy following me on the road, and well, she didn't respond. She didn't say a word, didn't even change her facial expression. I demand her to call the cops. There's a guy following me, yet nothing. She just kept looking at me with that unchanging expression. After a while of getting nowhere, so I told her I'm going back to my room. The path to my room was filled with paranoia, looking around just to know where he was, if I'm safe. I opened the door and scanned the room for my stuff, then went for my car keys. I had a new plane, drop room keys, and drive away, but that plan had been scrapped fast, because when I decided to look over at my car, he was standing next to. I slammed and locked the door, closed the current. I was sitting on the motel's bed, heart beating out of my chest, just wishing it could be over. It was strange, I never had the thought of hitting it, and luckily or unluckily, I never got to know what would happen if I did. I don't know how, I don't remember when, but I had fallen asleep on that bed. The somber feeling of sleep was broken abruptly. In the room, it was dark, but there was a light that could be seen coming from outside. It shined through the open doorway. Above was him looking down at me. His pale, rubbery skin, which lacked facial hair, the distorted black clothes, and a pin on his chest of 2 diamonds intersecting, the muted blonde hair that seemed to form his ears. His mouth looked like it was a horizontal cut through his face, 2 puncture holes for a nose. The eyes were perfectly circular with their pure black irises, staring at me. Foggy-headed, I ran to the bathroom, locking the door. Turning the bathroom lights on, the glaring lights hit my eyes, hurting them. And after minutes of waiting, I made the worst choice. I get on my hands and knees, move my head to ground, and I look underneath the door, and he was there looking back at me. In his irises, I saw what looked like metal tubing that led to a dark void. I jumped back in shock, slamming my head on motel toilet. Sitting there, waiting till he left, that was the last thing I remember of that night. I woke up in the motel bed again. It was daytime. I checked my phone, it said it was 9 a.m. and at 52%. My stuff was at the places I left them at. Decided to look out the window, and the parking lot was full of cars. Was it really just that? But before I could relax, I noticed the bathroom door was open. I never opened it before I left on the walk. After I left the motel and came back home, I would tell family friends the story, and I don't blame them for not believing me. After a while, even I stopped believing it. Took me 2 months to get back to nightly walking. I don't ever take it alone though, only walk in crowded areas now. Everything was going back to normal, but one day on trip, a couple of months ago, one of my friends pointed out when we were out on a beach, a scar on the back of my neck. It was 2 diamonds intersecting.